Hi everyone, Daljeet Peterson here with astrolab21.com. This video we're going to be looking at Gemini season 2023, which is about to start on the 21st of May here. Within the next 24 hours, the sun will be moving into Gemini. And it looks like this is shaping up to be a pretty intense month with some of the transits we have in effect as we start Gemini season. And as I said in my 2023 preview for this entire calendar year, really this 3 months that started in March, April, May, and into June was sort of astrologically going to be the most intense probably period of this calendar year. So we're certainly seeing that play out. We just had a really eventful Taurus season. We had the solar eclipse in Taurus that kicked off Taurus season. We had the lunar eclipse in Scorpio a couple weeks later. We had the intense square from Pluto, a theme that continues, as we'll see as we look at Gemini season. We had a really unique Mercury retrograde back through Taurus and its contact with Uranus in that sign, creating some really individual and unique ways of looking at this retrograde that we just came through. Now we're going to be looking at Mars has stationed, moving direct, will during the course of Gemini season move back into contact with Uranus. So there's this kind of window of this 6-week period that I've talked about as being the opportunity for a mental makeover. All right. We also are going to talk about the nodal axis, as we have been talking about for the last almost 18 months now, as we've had the nodes moving through Taurus and Scorpio respectively. They're in the final degrees of their transit of those two signs, which means the first degrees, right? Because they always move retrograde. So the nodes are at 2 degrees right now, and within the next few weeks, or about a month, I think, they'll be moving out into Aries and Libra. So a huge frequency shift in terms of the background frequencies that we're going to experience. We've had Pluto moving into Aquarius, which was a big theme as we looked at March. We had Saturn moving into Pisces, all these major shifts of the outer planets moving signs. Now we're going to see we have Jupiter moving into Taurus this month. We have Mars moving into Leo, and a pretty potent and intense grand fixed cross that we're going to be working with as the energy of this month. So lots to get to. I've got the chart as usual. We'll also look at some graphics that'll help us sort of unpack some of the archetypal themes that we're embracing and we're experiencing with these transits, and maybe help us understand our own place in them, how they're affecting us personally, and also how they're shaping up in terms of what's happening globally, collectively, right, geopolitically, because a lot of these things do tend to manifest on that level, especially when we're dealing with Pluto. So without further ado, let's jump in and bring up the charts. I've got the chart up for right now. It's counting live as we speak. We're here May 20th, 2023. It's a little before noon here on the East Coast. And yeah, here's what we have. Here's the sky now as we're looking at it. And just we can see a lot of energy and intensity. As I said, I think Taurus season is ending much the same way as it began, with a lot going on in the sign of Taurus. We've got the last degree here. Tomorrow the sun will move into Gemini, but we can see a couple things that are significant. Just a few days ago, Jupiter moved into the sign of Taurus. And just yesterday, or overnight really, Mars moved into Leo. And this is a configuration that I've been looking at with some weariness, I'll say. We can see that we have an exact opposition here to Pluto in Aquarius, which is now moving retrograde, right? It's going to be before the end of Gemini season here, within the next month. Pluto will have retrograded back into Capricorn. And something else we've been looking at in terms of 2023 into 2024, Pluto's doing this dance across these two archetypes that is really, I think, defining the theme of the sort of threshold that we all find ourselves on, personally, interpersonally, collectively. We're moving from this Capricorn energy to this Aquarian energy, and it has been tricky, right? And I'm very interested. I think it's fascinating to see how much the talk about all the AI and the chat GPT, and it's just, there's an obsession about it. What a perfect storyline to the unfolding of the Pluto in Aquarius era. This is going to be a major theme of this next nearly 2 decades. We're going to be grappling with our relationship to our technology, this sort of idea of humanity and technology converging, right? The great convergence, the sort of transhumanism, the idea that technology is going to save the day, that it has this great leveling quality, it is the great equalizer, it is going to enhance humanity, we're going to live forever. All of these sort of technological utopias, very much a Pluto in Aquarius type of theme. Of course, there's a shadow side to all these, as you've learned, if you know astrology, you study these archetypes, or you follow this channel. We always have to be wary of the shadow sides, right? And Aquarius has a very sort of authoritarian streak to it. It can be very cold and aloof in its technological implementation, right? It's very scientific, it's very rational, but it can also, promote certain sort of authoritarian qualities. So there's those dark dystopias are also equally as, sort of present within this archetypal complex. So I think it's an interesting thing to watch. It'll be interesting to see as we move back into Capricorn, how does that conversation shift? And what are the major themes playing out as this planet Pluto dances across the threshold of these 2 archetypes, these 2 signs? And as we're trying to sort of figure out how do we put a dot, a period on this period that has been Pluto in Capricorn since 2008, that began with the 2008 financial crisis. It's been a challenge to the Capricorn social structure and hierarchy that culminated with 2020 and the coronavirus, the pandemic, the global shutdown. These are sort of bookends to this period in a lot of ways. So we're moving through lots, so that's sort of a big macro picture. But the thing that has me interested or fascinated or a little concerned actually with this Mars opposition is that, one of the things we looked at in terms of the last time Mars was conjunct with Pluto, right, which was back in the end of February of 2022, which was, it's always a tensious, it can be a very aggressive, violent type of configuration. Anytime Mars and Pluto get together, they're both very aggressive, right? One's considered the higher octave and the lower octave of that aggressive energy, right? Mars is very sort of conscious and active, and where Pluto is unconscious, right? And it's reactive in a lot of ways. Reactivity, like radioactive in a way. So, and we can even go back, if we look back, we go back about 14 months or so to the beginning of the end of February here, February 24th, we can see it was at about, I think it was 27 degrees of Capricorn when we had that conjunction of Mars and Pluto. And of course, Venus was in the picture as well. We'd had that Mars-Venus conjunction. And at the time, maybe there was some hope that some of that Venusian energy may have, softened the effect of this transit. Maybe diplomacy would have won the day. There was a lot of people who thought it would. Turned out that Venus did not get a seat at that table. It turned out to be a very Mars-Pluto type of conjunction of energy. And if we look at, what Mars and Pluto represents here, it's not surprising when you combine these 2 archetypes and you can see some of the possible configurations you can get, right? Both Mars is very aggressive, but, so is Pluto, right? They're a different kind of aggression. Mars is associated with that sort of really masculine and macho type of energy. It's all about potency and virility and conquest. It's very martial. It's very Martian, right? It's militant in a way. It's libidinal. It just has to express its force. use of force, willpower, right? All of these things, when that comes into contact with Pluto, right, with its sort of instinctual, deep, volcanic, unconscious type of violence that is massive, that is titanic, that is extreme, right, destructive, can involve the criminal underworld, the subterranean. Like, this is such a chthonic power, as you might say, a primordial power. It has depth. So anytime these two archetypes, these two planets come into alignment, especially a conjunction, right, it's going to have this, just a doubling of the potency of this. And so, when we looked at, what are those qualities, right? Well, on a positive side, it's, this intense willpower is manifest. It can be efforts that, regenerative efforts, right? Because Pluto is all about regeneration, and Mars just gives it the effort to really, that evolutionary quality to it. A lot of courage and resolve, right? A volcanic catharsis, has a sexual dynamism. There's a sexual potency to both of these signs. I should say these planets, right? Of course, on the shadow side, it's like brute force, right? Ruthlessness, predatory aggression, pushing too hard, sexual aggression, right? And so we could have seen this play out, almost on script when we think about the war in the Ukraine, right? It was this brute force and like a ruthless, aggressive energy. And everyone would say, oh, Putin's pushing too hard, right? And you could say, if, in some ways, the Ukrainians showed great courage and resolve and willpower to defend their country. And of course, you can also just flip-flop these perspectives too, because, as always, I like to use astrology as really apolitical in a lot of ways, right? You could see that the shadow side was actually maybe the NATO alliance pushing too hard on Russia, trying to, involve their border countries in this NATO alliance, that it was actually a predatory aggression on the part of the West, right? And if you were a Russian nationalist, you may think, yes, this is taking great courage and resolve for us to fight back against the Western hegemony and restore power and pride in Russia's great heritage, right? Regenerative efforts to bring back great Mother Russia of the past. So, interesting to see always, right? This complex of archetypal configurations can play out and is always ever present at once. They're all commingling, right? And so as individuals, we have the opportunity to engage with these archetypes consciously, right, in order to enhance their more proactive or evolutionary benefits. But when we're operating unconsciously, it tends to take on more of the shadow qualities. So this applies to us personally, this applies to our interpersonal relationships, and it applies to the relationships between nations and geopolitical powers. And, often when we're dealing with Pluto, it is the most transpersonal of all the transpersonal archetypes, and its influence does tend to show up more concretely, perhaps, in world events, in the mundane astrology. So interesting things to consider there as we look at this Mars-Pluto, relationship. So if we think about it, began under the influence of this Mars and Pluto conjunction back in, February into March when the war broke out. So it's interesting now to track, and if we go back to the calendar now Mars has moved a full half of the zodiac away from Pluto, and basically that has been the span of this war thus far. The last 14 months has been under this influence. And so it's always interesting when Mars is going to come back and make one of these angular aspects to the original conjunction, which is now shifted into Aquarius. So we have a different theme unfolding. So it'd be interesting just to watch what transpires under this. It may manifest as something very concrete. It may be something very subtle. It's hard to know. I thought it was interesting, though, that I was, I've been watching the news, and, last night the big news was out of the G7, G8 summit, where Biden said, hey, we're going to give the F-16s to the Ukrainians, which has previously been a red line. He wouldn't cross, and now he's had this change of heart for whatever reason. Who knows what came up for him during the most recent, Taurus Scorpio axis eclipses. He is a Scorpio after all. So maybe there were some secrets revealed to him about what should or shouldn't happen. Hard to read behind the lines and behind the closed doors of all this political machination. But this has a very political quality to it, and we'll see why when we talk about how Jupiter comes into this picture as well. So, you can see what's shaping up, and as I'll talk about it, get the right tool here. Yeah. So here's the opposition, right? So that's pretty obvious. But we'll also see that these planets are both squaring Jupiter, as it's also at 0 degrees of Taurus, which is very closely conjunct with the North Node at 2 degrees. And so that means Pluto and Mars are also in square to the nodal axis as well. So this is what we would call a fixed grand cross, involving 3 of the power players of the planetary system. You've got Pluto, Jupiter, and Mars involved in this. We're talking about the nodal axis. This is setting up to be the intense showdown that we might expect from such an aspect like this. This is what was, as I looked, and most astrologers, when we looked at 2023, probably pointed to this as being something big is brewing here with this kind of configuration. And we can go back and go back to my slides here, because I want to talk. I think it's helpful to look at these things in terms of some of these, archetypal ways of looking. So what happens now? We've talked about this Pluto-Mars, and we've got a flavor for what that feels like, right? That very aggressive, often violent type of action, right? What happens when you bring Jupiter into the picture here? Well, Jupiter, we always say about Jupiter, it expands everything it touches. So in one way, you can say it's just going to amplify all of this aggression of this Mars-Pluto opposition, as it sits right between the two. All 3 at 0 degrees of the fixed signs, right? We've got Pluto in fixed Aquarius, Mars in fixed Leo, Jupiter in fixed Taurus. So not only is this a tension by virtue of this T-square these 3 planets are forming, but they're in fixed signs, which means none of them are going to want to give in. There's no compromise in this kind of aspect. So this is an uncompromising T-square. We also may find, there's the possibility, sure, Jupiter expands, but it also brings its sort of more generous, liberal, optimistic type of perspective. It's the great guru, the wise one. It's calm, it's hopeful, it's optimistic, it wants truth. It's the sort of liberal, generous spirituality that Jupiter can bring. So in some ways we could have a hope that it sort of tempers some of the more aggressive, compulsive, obsessive qualities of what we might expect from a Mars-Pluto opposition. But it's interesting, you can just start to see what kinds of things could be constellated by these 3 powerful archetypes, right? You could have, if you think about, independent power that is excessive power for an urge for independence, right? You could get this sort of instinctual optimism, right? That, someone can think, oh, we have a huge advantage here, right? But it may be headstrong. It may be something that's it's impatient. It's a selfish use of power. Versus some sort of higher use of power, right? It could be overindulgence in the use of power and violence. There's just so many ways that these things can be sort of constellated. Now, it also, as we know, it's bringing in the nodal axis into this square, right? Because you've got the North Node in Taurus, South Node in Scorpio, 2 fixed signs that they've been dancing through for the last, 16 months or so. And so the qualities that are also being constellated because this grand square is involving the nodes, right? This idea of the North Node of material destiny, technical skills, talents, relentless and disciplined. There's an aggression to the North Node as well that just gets amplified by being contacted by Pluto and Mars, right? The South Node has this more mystical quality. We think about it as past lives versus the future. Right? We think about the nodal axis as somewhat of a compass that's pointing us in the new direction. Tends to be a little more, sensitive and compassionate. And it's interesting. It talks about blending the qualities of Mars and Neptune. So it's sort of like the energy for transcendent spirituality, where the North Node has the qualities of Saturn and Pluto, which is relentless and disciplined versus sensitive and compassionate. So another interesting thing to fold into this picture that we're getting. So we talked about Mars and Pluto. We saw that with this aggressive brute force type of energy. What happens when we think of bringing Mars together with Jupiter? Well, this can give us some different sort of qualities when these two energies are combined. You get exuberant energies. You get this wholesome confidence, fortunate actions, great accomplishments, a positive synergy, right? If you take Mars's often neutral energy, right? It's just that aggression isn't dark or manipulative or necessarily like evil. It doesn't have any qualities like that. It just is energy that needs to be used. So if you can combine Mars and Jupiter in the most positive ways, it's just energy to achieve, greatness, to do great things in ways that would amplify Jupiter's ability to bring those things to bear. But you can also get the shadow side, and just realize I have the Saturn symbol behind here. I didn't change that to Jupiter, so my bad. Let's just ignore that. This self-aggrandizement, obnoxious theatrics, philosophical extremism. Here's interesting: nationalism and expansionism, right? Mars and Jupiter, right? Mars is aggressive energy to expand Jupiter. So we could see how this plays out on the global stage quite literally, right? And then you have to consider, what happens if we take Jupiter and Pluto together? Because now we've got Jupiter in this T-square mix. Well, great resources and potential, right? Dramatic opportunities for change. Titanic evolutionary forces, intense idealism, and I just love this phrase, meta trajectories of history, right? You think about Pluto, which is this very much the slowest moving planet, the longest cycles that we look at in terms of its, orbiting of the zodiac, 250 years nearly. Jupiter, the great expander of energies. We think about the Jupiter-Saturn cycle as really representing the sort of pace of history. So interesting to see that this can show us, right, the meta trajectories of history, these sort of divine plans that seem to be unfolding. And it does seem like we're at some critical point in history where we're about to make a shift into a new era and a new phase. Of course, we can see some shadows of this as well, right? When that Jupiter expands Pluto's darker libidinal energies, we can get extreme ambition, right? Obsession with glory and greatness, right? Abuses of power, political dramas. This is the signature for what we would call plutocracy. And these are all, and you could look at, again, you could say, I can see all of this as being Russia and Putin, and this is all the Western alliances and our, or you could flip-flop them and say, this is Russia and this is the West, right? You have to be able to take sort of that, apolitical perspective on this and see, how is this stuff really playing out? And what is it? What does it mean? What does it mean to be living through these times when we have these massive energies playing out? This is what it is, right? But it gives us that perspective. If you can see this, it's just a much deeper understanding of these cycles that are playing out, and how when we see these things showing up, you go, I see how that's archetypally present, right? I see how that's constellating, and then you can see, what are those patterns? How is this unfolding? How is this energy playing out, in the collective? How am I engaging with it? What is it triggering within me, in my relationships, in my immediate community, as well as in the global community? This is the power and the utility, right, of astrology. So let's go back to the charts here and take a deeper look at what we're getting here with this configuration. So this is the end technically of Taurus season, and what has been a pretty intense, I think, month, all things considered, right? And there's a lot going on in the world. We've got the outbreak of the war in the Sudan that's also adding to this martial, aggressive, warlike quality that you tend to get whenever Mars and Pluto come into alignment. But it'll be interesting to see what's the difference between what we had with the conjunction of those two planets versus this opposition. Right? So it's a different energy, right? I'm really interested to see what Mars does as it moves through Leo. This is a pretty fiery Mars. This is an aggressive Mars. This is we could say an arrogant Mars. I think I put up, Mars and Leo, right? So here's another way of looking at this. Now we take a planet and its energy as it moves through a sign, and these qualities it's going to take on as it moves through Leo for the next month, right? So that willpower, that desire for self-expression, that creativity, that energy, but it can be domineering, it could be over prideful, snobbish, strong-willed, right? There's a theatricalness to it, right? So when you get Mars moving through Leo, we could see how this energy could be expressed quite differently. And it's competing, or it's in contrast to Pluto and Aquarius, right? We've got Jupiter moving through Taurus now, right? You can start to see, well, what does that mean, right? How does Jupiter's expansive, jovial, optimistic energy express itself while it goes through Taurus? Well, it's going to be very practical. It's going to be looking at the fixed earth archetype of Taurus. It's about values, right? It's about perseverance. It's about the practical. It's very conservative, right? So you have this liberal quality of Jupiter having to embrace more conservative perspectives of Taurus. Bit of a contradiction there. How does that play out, right? There's something very grounding about Taurus. So Jupiter's time in Taurus, which is going to be, roughly the next year. It takes about, about a year to go through each sign. So this will be an interesting change, right? Where we've just had Jupiter moving through Aries, entirely different energy. Now we're getting it's kind of slows it down a little bit, right? You could have this sense of, after Jupiter's sort of audacious moves through Aries, and it's like everything is possible and new horizons, and we're on the cusp of new things, and there was this sort of, we finally had, broken free from the restrictions of a lot of the COVID restrictions, and we were moving. Things felt like they were moving again. Okay, now it hits Taurus, and maybe you'll feel this need to slow it down a little bit, to take stock in what is of value, what is more important, more material, right? More grounded in the here and now. So that's another interesting way of looking at these archetypes. And then you look at Pluto's into Aquarius, right? This is the period that we are really moving into. And this is an interesting, and again, this can play out in any number of ways, right? You get this, this primordial depth that Pluto is really about, I think, ever evolving, right? It's evolutionary. It really wants to transmutation, right? It's the mutative force, the evolutionary pressure to evolve past what doesn't work, and it will destroy what isn't working. It will eliminate what isn't working, right? It's the life, death, rebirth. It's the cycle of life, right? But it's all about power, and it can be very unconscious, it can be very compulsive, and difficult, challenging, right? These are usually Plutonian experiences, they're life and death, right? And so when it's moving through Aquarius, it's just going to amplify all of these Aquarian themes that we are going to be really challenged with, right? The sort of our scientific ways, the scientific method itself will be coming under great scrutiny during this time. Science is having a crisis, if you will, between the old 20th century relativity of Einstein and the new 20th century, physics that are contradicting in some ways, right? When you look at the quantum stuff. So that all seems to be constellated by this transit. We're also, our use of technology, right? This whole AI conflict that is going to be constellated here, right? We get that sort of brighter side of Aquarius, the fellowship of all humanity. It's the great equalizer. It's very progressive and free thinking, right? It's ruled by Uranus. But it also can be, as I said, perverse, tactless, aloof, detached, extremist, right? It can really constellate some of the darker sides of technology. And I think we will be facing the dark side of technology, the limitations of our scientific processes as we try to grapple with how to move forward and to evolve into the next phase of what it is to be human. So, I mean, that's a lot, right? There's a lot to digest in there, which is why, when you get this type of configuration, right, and just so you can see it more clearly, we just pop everything off here and just really look at what it is really at the core of what I feel like this month is about. And it's really going to set a tone for the rest of the year. The things that we do personally under this aspect, the things that take place in the world under this aspect will resonate with this energy for weeks and months to come, right? This energy is going to be in effect for at least a couple months. Mars will move on and come out of aspect, but Jupiter and Pluto are much slower moving. That square between those two is going to stay in effect for quite some time over the next few months. If you think about a 5-degree orb, right? And it's going to be interesting as Pluto goes back into Capricorn and it drags this square energy and this cardinal cross energy back into the unfinished business. I talk about that a lot in my 2023 preview, right? We're going to have to deal with our unfinished Capricorn business. Individually, interpersonally, community, collectively, transpersonally, globally. All of this stuff is unfinished. A lot of it comes down to material resources, values, Taurus issues, right? We've got Uranus, still there in Taurus. So, financial systems, money supply, right? The role of the dollar as a global currency, right? The institutions, Capricorn, the structures of society, every institution has been challenged, right? We've talked about this, the financial layers, the economic layers, the educational layers, the layers of industry, right? The supply chain issues, the globalism, the political layer, the cultural layer, all coming under intense energy to transform Pluto. So this is one of the, I think the great perspectives that astrology gives us. And so I like to highlight these. And, when I see this type of configuration as an astrologer, we're always looking ahead to these things, right? And it's kind of like when we looked at what was happening in the spring of 2020, right? Couldn't have known, although some astrologers did say, because it was one of the configurations of Pluto and Saturn and Mars all together is pandemics, or it does have that connotation. But you see that going forward, you go, wow, that's going to be something big unfolding. So this does set us up to be something pretty intense, I would say, for Gemini season. So take that for what it's worth. Hopefully that perspective helps you just sort of understand some of the bigger sort of global geopolitical machinations that are unfolding. If we consider the eclipses on Scorpio-Taurus axis that we just came through, a lot of secrets being revealed, a lot of things hidden and uncovered. You've got the issue of the U.S. airman in Massachusetts and his trial coming up. We've had issues with the former president and, some of this sexual misconduct. We saw how much this Pluto-Mars often constellates things of sexual aggression, right? a former president of the United States was, I don't say convicted because it's a civil trial, but was convicted of sexual aggression, right? And forced to pay a heavy fine money. So it's just fascinating, isn't it? So, not a lot of personal insights. I apologize for this one. I felt like this warranted a sort of bigger picture perspective. But of course, all of these are playing out for us on an individual basis as well. And, if you have planets in your natal chart anywhere in these early degrees of any of the fixed signs, right? If you have early Taurus, early Scorpio, early Aquarius, early Leo, say your sun or your moon or your rising are there, wow, you're probably going to feel the impact of this transit pretty profoundly. So there may be some intense energies coming up for you in your life, in relationship dynamics, right? The oppositions, right? In conflict, in having a hard time reconciling different aspects of your life. Your maybe your live work balance, maybe relationship dynamics, maybe family things are coming up. So, I hope you have a good sense of your own chart. It really does help to see when these transits are coming because, particularly things like a Pluto-Mars transit on a sensitive point in your birth chart, always with Pluto transits, they can feel overwhelming. Right. And that's the thing with the transpersonal energies. It's like, it feels like it's a power greater than us, and it tends to be like, oh, things happen to us. The world is conspiring against me. These are forces that I cannot control or even combat, right? I just get completely overwhelmed during Pluto transits. And they're long lasting too. They can be in effect for upwards of 2 years, right? You get a Pluto transit of your sun, say. That's a 2-year, experience with peak intensities within that. And so, but also great times of opportunities for evolutionary change, to mutate ourselves. What are we trying to become as individuals, right? So that's always food for thought. All of these things can always be extrapolated back down to the individual level, and they can be extrapolated outwards, obviously, to the global level, which is, again, the beauty of astrology. So anyway, hopefully that's insightful. Hopefully that's helpful. I'm sure, like me, you may be watching the news and the events unfolding just to see how this energy pattern plays out, because it really is going to help us get a kind of a roadmap of what these energies are doing, how they're manifesting, how they're constellating, and how we can then sort of engage with these energies on a personal level, right? How are we going to transform our own energy to evolve? Some of those qualities we looked at in the slides I presented, take a look at those, scroll back and just see how does that play out for me personally. We use the example of geopolitics, but those relationship dynamics come down to you and me and our own relationships and our family and our friends and our colleagues and our workplace and our community. So see if you can apply that for yourself. I'd be curious. Leave me a comment if you've had some intense times here in this past Taurus season. If you have planets on these sensitive points, and if there's things that you're going through that would help myself or other viewers who read the comments understand this stuff, I encourage you to do that. I'm always interested in seeing your comments. So that's it. Hopefully you like that. Obviously, always the mantra, like and subscribe if you do, so that we can get more people viewing this channel and sharing information. I think it's helpful. Hit the subscribe button if you can. And we'll see you next time. And hopefully everyone has a safe and healthy Gemini season. All right. Till then. Sat Nam.